May 1945. A convoy of American military vehicles rolls through the shattered streets of Nordhausen, Germany. The war in Europe has been over for barely 2 weeks. The air still carries the acrid smell of burning buildings and cordite. Among the soldiers and intelligence officers sits a group of men in civilian clothes, engineers and scientists who have been summoned with extreme urgency. They have been told only that they are about to see something that will change everything they know about modern warfare. The convoy stops at the entrance to a vast underground complex carved into the Harz Mountains. As they descend into the tunnels, their footsteps echo off stone walls that still bear the marks of forced labor. The tunnels stretch for miles, a subterranean factory built by slave workers who died by the thousands in conditions that defy human comprehension. But it is not the horror of Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp that has brought these engineers here today. It is what was manufactured in these tunnels. They round a corner and stop. Before them, lying on its side in the dim light, is a missile 46 feet long, gleaming white and black, shaped like something from the pages of a science fiction magazine. This is the Vergeltungswaffe 2, the Vengeance Weapon 2, the V-2 rocket, the first ballistic missile. And in this moment, standing in the darkness of a captured Nazi facility, these American engineers are looking at technology that will define the next century of human history. The men approach the rocket slowly, almost reverently. Some of them touch its smooth metal skin, feeling the precision of its construction. Others examine the fins at the base, the intricate plumbing of fuel lines, the sophisticated guidance system housed in the nose cone. These are not ordinary engineers. They are among the most brilliant minds America has gathered for this mission, specialists in aerodynamics, propulsion, material science. Many of them have spent years working on conventional weapons, artillery shells, and aircraft engines, and nothing in their experience has prepared them for what they are seeing now. One engineer pulls out a notebook and begins sketching the fuel injector assembly. Another is measuring the thickness of the hull. A propulsion specialist is on his knees examining the rocket nozzle with a look of disbelief on his face. They work in near silence, but the air is electric with realization. The Germans have done something extraordinary. They have not simply built a new weapon, they have leapfrogged an entire generation of technology. They have created a system that can carry a ton of explosives over 200 miles at speeds approaching 4,000 miles per hour. They have built a rocket that flies to the edge of space itself, reaching altitudes of over 50 miles, where the air is so thin that conventional aircraft cannot function. They have engineered a weapon that gives no warning before it strikes, that travels faster than sound, that arrives before its own roar. And they have done all of this while America and Britain were still perfecting the bomber aircraft. The story of how Germany reached this point begins not in the tunnels of Nordhausen, but in the minds of dreamers and visionaries decades earlier. In the 1920s, while most of the world saw rockets as little more than fireworks, a handful of men in Germany began to imagine something greater. They were inspired by Hermann Oberth, a Romanian-born physicist whose 1923 book, The Rocket into Planetary Space, laid out the mathematical principles for spaceflight with startling clarity. Oberth proved that liquid-fueled rockets could reach velocities sufficient to escape Earth's gravity, that humans could, in theory, travel to other worlds. His work attracted young men who saw in rocketry not just a scientific curiosity, but a pathway to the stars. Among them was a teenage aristocrat named Wernher von Braun. In 1930, at the age of 18, von Braun joined a group called the Society for Space Travel, a collection of engineers and enthusiasts who built and tested primitive rockets in an abandoned ammunition dump outside Berlin. They called it the Raketenflugplatz, the rocket flight place. They had no funding, no facilities, and no support from government or industry, but they had passion and vision and a willingness to learn from failure. Their rockets exploded far more often than they flew. But with each explosion came knowledge, refinement, incremental progress towards something no one had achieved before. Then came 1932 and everything changed. The German army, restricted by the Treaty of Versailles from developing many conventional weapons, began to see in rocketry a loophole. Artillery was limited by treaty, aircraft were limited, but rockets, these experimental devices that barely worked, were not mentioned in any international agreement. Captain Walter Dornberger of the Army Ordnance Department attended a demonstration by von Braun's amateur rocket group. What he saw was crude and unreliable, but Dornberger was not a man who lacked imagination. He saw potential. He saw a weapon that could strike deep into enemy territory without requiring aircraft or artillery within range. He offered von Braun and his colleagues something they had never possessed before: money, resources, and official backing. In exchange, they would work for the German military. The age of amateur rocketry was over. The age of the missile had begun. The German rocket program established itself at a remote location on the Baltic coast, a place called Peenemünde. It was here, on a windswept peninsula far from prying eyes, that von Braun and his team would spend the next decade transforming rocket science from fantasy into reality. The early work was painstaking and frustrating. Rockets exploded on the launch pad. They veered off course seconds after liftoff. They disintegrated under the stress of acceleration or the heat of their own exhaust. Every failure had to be analyzed, every problem solved through calculation and experimentation. There were no textbooks for building ballistic missiles, no established engineering principles to follow. They were inventing everything from scratch. The cooling system for the rocket motor, the fuel pumps capable of handling volatile liquids, the guidance system that could keep a supersonic projectile on course, the aerodynamic shape that could survive passage through different atmospheric layers. Every component required innovation. Every system had to be tested and retested and tested again. Years passed. The researchers at Peenemünde developed a series of prototypes, each designated by a letter and number. The A1 and A2 were small experimental vehicles. The A3 was larger, but plagued by guidance problems. The A4, begun in 1939, was intended to be the final operational design, a rocket that could carry a 1-ton warhead across 200 miles. But making it work would take 4 more years of relentless effort. On October 3, 1942, the breakthrough finally came. An A4 rocket rose from its launch pad at Peenemünde, its engine roaring with 56,000 pounds of thrust. It climbed through the atmosphere, its speed increasing until it broke the sound barrier and continued accelerating. At the apex of its trajectory, it reached an altitude of 53 miles, entering the realm of space itself before arcing downward and striking its target area nearly 200 miles away. It was the first artificial object to reach space. It was the first vehicle to achieve supersonic flight. It was a moment that should have been celebrated as one of the greatest achievements in human engineering. Instead, it was a weapon of war. Dornberger, watching the launch, reportedly said, "This is the key to the universe." This is the first day of the space age. Von Braun, standing beside him, could only think about perfecting the design, about building more rockets, about proving that his vision of spaceflight had military value so that the funding would continue. The Nazis renamed the A4 the Vergeltungswaffe II, the Vengeance Weapon II, and ordered it into mass production. By 1943, with Germany facing increasingly desperate circumstances on all fronts, Hitler became obsessed with wonder weapons that might turn the tide of the war. The V-2 represented everything he wanted: a terror weapon, unstoppable, that could strike London and other Allied cities with no defense possible. He ordered production accelerated regardless of cost. The manufacturing was moved to the underground facilities at Mittelbau-Dora, where concentration camp prisoners were worked to death assembling rockets in conditions of unimaginable cruelty. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by the weapon itself, a grim calculus that speaks to both the desperation of the Nazi regime and the moral bankruptcy of those who prioritized technological achievement over human life. The first operational V-2 was launched against Paris on September 6, 1944. 2 days later, the bombardment of London began. Over the following months, more than 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched against Allied targets. They struck without warning. No air raid siren could provide alert because the rocket arrived before the sound of its approach. One moment there was normalcy, the next moment there was an explosion that could level a city block. The psychological impact was profound. But the strategic impact was negligible. The V-2 was wildly inaccurate, often missing its intended target by miles. It was phenomenally expensive, consuming resources that Germany desperately needed for tanks and aircraft and conventional munitions. And it came too late to change the outcome of a war that Germany had already lost. But none of this diminished the technological achievement. When American forces captured Peenemünde and Nordhausen in the spring of 1945, they found not just rockets, but an entire infrastructure of advanced engineering. They found wind tunnels for testing aerodynamic designs. They found laboratories where materials were analyzed and guidance systems refined. They found detailed technical drawings and documentation. They found, in short, the blueprint for the future of rocketry. And they found the scientists and engineers who had created it all. The American military immediately recognized the value of what they had captured. An operation was launched to seize as much V-2 hardware and expertise as possible before the advancing Soviet army could claim it. Hundreds of tons of rocket components were loaded onto trains and trucks and shipped to the port of Antwerp. Then across the Atlantic to the United States, engineers carefully dismantled complete V-2 rockets, cataloging every part, every system, every innovation. And they began recruiting the German rocket scientists themselves. This was Operation Paperclip, one of the most controversial intelligence operations in American history. The moral calculus was brutally simple. The Soviets were also capturing German scientists and technology, and the United States could not afford to fall behind in what was already becoming a new kind of conflict. The Cold War had not yet been formally declared, but its outlines were already clear. Rocket technology would be central to the coming confrontation. And so American officials made a devil's bargain, bringing Nazi scientists to the United States, sanitizing their records, overlooking their collaboration with a genocidal regime because their knowledge was deemed too valuable to leave behind. Among the American engineers and scientists brought in to evaluate the captured V-2 technology was a man who had every reason to feel both vindicated and bitter. Dr. Robert Goddard had spent decades as America's lone voice in the wilderness of rocketry, a physicist ridiculed by the press and ignored by the military, whose pioneering work had been conducted largely in isolation with minimal funding. In 1919, Goddard had published a paper titled A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes, which proposed using rockets for high-altitude research and suggested that a rocket could even reach the moon. The New York Times mocked him mercilessly, editorializing that Goddard lacked even the knowledge ladled out daily in high schools and clearly did not understand basic physics. The ridicule stung, but Goddard continued his work. In 1926, he launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket from a farm in Massachusetts. It flew for only 2.5 seconds, reaching an altitude of 41 feet, but it proved the concept worked. Over the following years, working in near obscurity in the New Mexico desert, Goddard developed gyroscopic guidance systems, lightweight fuel pumps, efficient cooling methods for rocket engines, and sophisticated nozzle designs. He took out patents on virtually every fundamental aspect of modern rocketry. But he worked in secrecy, paranoid about others stealing his ideas, and he refused to share his research broadly. The American military showed little interest in his work, seeing no practical application for rockets in warfare. Meanwhile, across the ocean, German engineers were reading Goddard's published papers with great interest. When Goddard was given the opportunity to inspect a captured V-2 in 1945, he arrived with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. He had heard rumors about the German rocket program, whispers of a missile that could reach the stratosphere. Now he would see it for himself. As he walked around the V-2, examining its fuel system, its turbo pump assembly, its guidance gyroscopes, his expression grew darker. The similarities to his own designs were unmistakable. Then came 1932 and everything changed. The German army, restricted by the Treaty of Versailles from developing many conventional weapons, began to see in rocketry a loophole. Artillery was limited by treaty, aircraft were limited, but rockets, these experimental devices that barely worked, were not mentioned in any international agreement. Captain Walter Dornberger of the Army Ordnance Department attended a demonstration by von Braun's amateur rocket group. What he saw was crude and unreliable, but Dornberger was not a man who lacked imagination. He saw potential. He saw a weapon that could strike deep into enemy territory without requiring aircraft or artillery within range. He offered von Braun and his colleagues something they had never possessed before: money, resources, and official backing. In exchange, they would work for the German military. The age of amateur rocketry was over. The age of the missile had begun. The German rocket program established itself at a remote location on the Baltic coast, a place called Peenemünde. It was here, on a windswept peninsula far from prying eyes, that von Braun and his team would spend the next decade transforming rocket science from fantasy into reality. The early work was painstaking and frustrating. Rockets exploded on the launch pad. They veered off course seconds after liftoff. They disintegrated under the stress of acceleration or the heat of their own exhaust. Every failure had to be analyzed, every problem solved through calculation and experimentation. There were no textbooks for building ballistic missiles, no established engineering principles to follow. They were inventing everything from scratch. The cooling system for the rocket motor, the fuel pumps capable of handling volatile liquids, the guidance system that could keep a supersonic projectile on course, the aerodynamic shape that could survive passage through different atmospheric layers. Every component required innovation. Every system had to be tested and retested and tested again. Years passed. The researchers at Peenemünde developed a series of prototypes, each designated by a letter and number. The A1 and A2 were small experimental vehicles. The A3 was larger, but plagued by guidance problems. The A4, begun in 1939, was intended to be the final operational design, a rocket that could carry a 1-ton warhead across 200 miles. But making it work would take 4 more years of relentless effort. On October 3, 1942, the breakthrough finally came. An A4 rocket rose from its launch pad at Peenemünde, its engine roaring with 56,000 pounds of thrust. It climbed through the atmosphere, its speed increasing until it broke the sound barrier and continued accelerating. At the apex of its trajectory, it reached an altitude of 53 miles, entering the realm of space itself before arcing downward and striking its target area nearly 200 miles away. It was the first artificial object to reach space. It was the first vehicle to achieve supersonic flight. It was a moment that should have been celebrated as one of the greatest achievements in human engineering. Instead, it was a weapon of war. Dornberger, watching the launch, reportedly said, "This is the key to the universe." This is the first day of the space age. Von Braun, standing beside him, could only think about perfecting the design, about building more rockets, about proving that his vision of spaceflight had military value so that the funding would continue. The Nazis renamed the A4 the Vergeltungswaffe 2, the Vengeance Weapon 2, and ordered it into mass production. By 1943, with Germany facing increasingly desperate circumstances on all fronts, Hitler became obsessed with wonder weapons that might turn the tide of the war. The V-2 represented everything he wanted: a terror weapon, unstoppable, that could strike London and other Allied cities with no defense possible. He ordered production accelerated regardless of cost. The manufacturing was moved to the underground facilities at Mittelbau-Dora, where concentration camp prisoners were worked to death assembling rockets in conditions of unimaginable cruelty. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by the weapon itself, a grim calculus that speaks to both the desperation of the Nazi regime and the moral bankruptcy of those who prioritize technological achievement over human life. The first operational V-2 was launched against Paris on September 6, 1944. 2 days later, the bombardment of London began. Over the following months, more than 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched against Allied targets. The fuel injectors, the cooling system where propellant was circulated through the motor's walls before being burned, the arrangement of the turbopump, the stabilizing fins, even specific design elements of the gyroscopic guidance system. These were not convergent solutions arrived at independently. These were his innovations, his intellectual property, embodied in a Nazi weapon. Goddard was convinced the Germans had studied his patents and publications and essentially copied his work, refining and scaling it up but building on his foundational ideas. He said as much to anyone who would listen. The Germans, for their part, acknowledged that they had read Goddard's papers in the early years but claimed their final designs were original. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Goddard had proven the concepts, but the Germans had done the immensely difficult work of engineering a functional weapon-scale system. Still, Goddard felt robbed. He had spent his life as a prophet without honor in his own country, and now he had to watch German engineers receive credit for bringing his dreams to reality, even if those dreams had been twisted into instruments of terror. But Goddard's personal grievances were a footnote to the larger realization sweeping through American military and scientific circles. The V-2 represented a paradigm shift. American engineers studying the captured rockets were struck by the sophistication of every system. The propulsion system used a turbopump that generated 560 horsepower, running at incredible speeds to force fuel and oxidizer into the combustion chamber at the rates necessary to produce sustained thrust. This turbopump was itself a marvel, driven by a steam generator that used concentrated hydrogen peroxide decomposed by a catalyst. The entire fuel system was a masterpiece of chemical engineering, balancing the volatile mix of liquid oxygen and alcohol-based fuel with precision timing. The guidance system used gyroscopes and accelerometers to detect deviations from the planned trajectory, sending correction signals to graphite vanes in the rocket exhaust that could steer the missile during powered flight. It was not perfect. The V-2's accuracy was terrible by later standards, but it worked, and it worked consistently enough to be produced by the thousands. The structure itself was revolutionary, a thin-skinned, pressurized body that gained its strength from internal pressure rather than heavy external bracing. This made the rocket far lighter than it would otherwise have been, crucial for achieving the performance needed to reach supersonic speeds and extreme altitudes. American engineers compiled detailed reports on the V-2, documenting every aspect of its design. These reports make fascinating reading, oscillating between admiration for the technical achievement and criticism of the rocket's practical limitations. One report noted that the V-2's inaccuracy made it useless for attacking military targets. Another calculated that the cost of producing each V-2 was equivalent to building several fighter aircraft, and the explosive payload of a single V-2 rocket was far less than what a single bomber could carry on multiple missions. The conclusion was obvious. As a weapon of war, the V-2 was inefficient, expensive, and strategically marginal. Germany would have been better served devoting those resources to conventional arms. But the same reports acknowledged that as a technological demonstration, the V-2 was extraordinary. It proved that ballistic missiles were feasible. It showed that payloads could be delivered at intercontinental scale distances without requiring vulnerable bombers to penetrate enemy airspace. And most ominously, it revealed that if a rocket could carry a 1-ton conventional warhead 200 miles, then a more advanced rocket could carry a nuclear warhead across an ocean. The atomic age and the missile age had arrived simultaneously, and their combination would define the geopolitics of the next half-century. The United States wasted no time in exploiting its captured windfall. Even before the war in Europe formally ended, Operation Paperclip was moving German rocket scientists and their families to America. The crown jewel of this operation was Werner von Braun himself. Von Braun had surrendered to American forces in May 1945, along with hundreds of his colleagues from Peenemünde. He understood perfectly that his knowledge made him valuable, and he was determined to continue his work on rockets under new management. American intelligence officers were initially skeptical. Von Braun had been a member of the Nazi Party and held a rank in the SS. His involvement in the use of slave labor at Mittelbau-Dora was documented, though the extent of his personal responsibility remains debated to this day. But Cold War pragmatism overrode moral considerations. Von Braun was exactly the kind of expert America needed, and the Soviets were recruiting German scientists just as aggressively. By September 1945, von Braun and more than 100 of his team were in the United States. Their records were sanitized, their Nazi affiliations downplayed or erased, and they were put to work for the U.S. Army. The captured V-2 components were shipped to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, the same desert where Goddard had conducted his lonely experiments years earlier. American and German engineers working together began assembling and launching V-2 rockets, both to test the weapons and to train a generation of American engineers in rocket technology. Between 1946 and 1952, the United States launched more than 60 captured and American-assembled V-2 rockets from White Sands. These launches were not military strikes. They were research missions. The V-2 provided a platform for high-altitude atmospheric research, for testing instrument packages in near-space conditions, for conducting experiments that were impossible with conventional aircraft. Scientists loaded the rockets with equipment to measure cosmic rays, to photograph Earth from altitudes where the curvature of the planet was visible, to study the effects of microgravity on biological samples. One V-2 carried a camera that captured the first images of Earth from space, grainy black and white photographs that showed the planet as a curved horizon against the blackness of space. These were baby steps toward space exploration, but they were steps that would not have been possible without the German rocket technology. Every launch, whether successful or catastrophic, taught American engineers lessons about propulsion, guidance, materials, and systems integration. The V-2 became the foundation on which American rocketry was built. But the implications extended far beyond scientific research. Military planners understood immediately that the future of warfare would involve missiles. The V-2 had shown the potential. Future designs would improve the accuracy, increase the range, and, most critically, carry nuclear warheads. The strategic calculus of the Cold War was shaped by this realization. If both superpowers possessed long-range nuclear-armed missiles, then mutual destruction was guaranteed, and war between them became unthinkable. The doctrine of deterrence was born from the marriage of atomic weapons and ballistic missile technology, and both technologies had been perfected at the end of World War II. The Soviet Union, for its part, had captured much of the Peenemünde facility and its own group of German scientists. They too began producing and launching V-2 rockets, reverse engineering the technology, and developing indigenous expertise. The parallel paths of American and Soviet missile development, both rooted in captured German technology, would drive the space race and the arms race for decades. Every major rocket system developed by the United States in the following years bore the unmistakable influence of the V-2. The Redstone rocket, developed by von Braun's team at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency in the 1950s, was a direct descendant of the V-2, similar in size and configuration, but with improved guidance and propulsion. The Redstone would launch America's first satellite, Explorer 1, in 1958. It would carry the first American astronaut, Alan Shepard, on his suborbital flight in 1961. The lineage was clear and undeniable. Von Braun himself became the public face of American rocketry. By the late 1950s, his Nazi past had been largely forgotten or forgiven by the American public, and he was celebrated as a visionary, the man who would take humanity to the moon. He appeared on television shows, consulted on Disney educational films, wrote popular articles about space travel, and eventually led the development of the Saturn V rocket that powered the Apollo program. It was a remarkable transformation, from Nazi engineer overseeing the production of vengeance weapons built by slave labor, to American hero standing in mission control as astronauts walked on the lunar surface. Whether this redemption was justified or whether it was merely the consequence of geopolitical necessity is a question that continues to provoke passionate debate. What is undeniable is that von Braun's expertise, purchased at such a terrible moral cost, accelerated American space capabilities by years, perhaps decades. The other German scientists brought to America under Operation Paperclip made similar contributions. Arthur Rudolph, who had been operations director at Mittelbau-Dora and had direct oversight of the slave labor used to build V-2 rockets, became a key figure in the Saturn V program. He was awarded NASA's highest honor, the Distinguished Service Medal, before his wartime activities were finally investigated in the 1980s, leading to his departure from the United States to avoid prosecution. Kurt de Boos, who had been a member of the SS and worked at Peenemünde, became the first director of NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine, conducted aerospace medical research for the U.S. Air Force, though his wartime research had involved experiments on concentration camp prisoners. The list goes on, more than 1,600 German scientists and engineers were brought to America under Operation Paperclip, and their contributions to American military and space technology were immense. But the cost of that contribution, the moral compromise involved in employing men who had served a genocidal regime, is a stain that cannot be erased or rationalized away. The V-2 itself became obsolete within a few years. Missile technology advanced rapidly, driven by Cold War competition and lavish military spending. By the 1950s, both superpowers were developing intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of striking targets on other continents, missiles far more advanced than the V-2 in range, accuracy, and payload capacity. The Titan, the Atlas, the Soviet R-7, these were the children and grandchildren of von Braun's creation, refined and improved, but built on the same fundamental principles. The V-2 was a prototype, a proof of concept, a first step, but it was a step that changed everything. Before the V-2, the idea of a weapon that could cross an ocean in minutes was fantasy. After the V-2, it was merely a matter of engineering refinement and political will. The genie was out of the bottle. The technology could not be uninvented. And so the world entered an era where cities could be destroyed by missiles launched from thousands of miles away, where the warning time between detection and impact could be measured in minutes, where the old concepts of defense through distance or fortification were rendered meaningless. This was the world the V-2 created. But the legacy of the V-2 is not purely military. The same technology that created terror weapons also opened the door to space exploration. The rockets that carried nuclear warheads also carried satellites, scientific instruments, and eventually human beings beyond the atmosphere. The Apollo program, which remains one of humanity's greatest achievements, was built on a foundation of missile technology. The International Space Station is serviced by rockets that descended from ballistic missile designs. The commercial space industry, which promises to make space accessible to civilians, relies on propulsion systems and engineering principles pioneered at Peenemünde. This is the dual nature of rocket technology, the fundamental ambiguity that haunts its history. The same engineering that can destroy can also explore. The same knowledge that enables weapons of mass destruction also enables humanity to reach for the stars. Von Braun himself seemed acutely aware of this ambiguity. In his later years, he spoke often about his vision of space exploration, his belief that humanity's destiny lay beyond Earth. He downplayed his role in creating weapons of terror, framing his wartime work as a necessary compromise that allowed him to pursue his true passion. Critics saw this as self-serving rationalization, an attempt to whitewash collaboration with evil. Supporters saw it as the pragmatism of a visionary who understood that great achievements require uncomfortable choices. Perhaps both perspectives contain truth. The immediate reaction of American engineers when they first encountered the V-2 in the spring of 1945 was shock, mixed with professional admiration and a dawning realization of how far behind the United States had fallen in rocket development. The detailed reports these engineers filed in the months after the war reveal a complex mixture of emotions. There is awe at the technical sophistication of the German rocket. There is frustration that America had not invested in similar research before the war. There is concern about the strategic implications of missile technology. And there is determination to catch up, to learn everything the Germans knew, to ensure that America would never again be surprised by a technological leap forward from an adversary. This determination would drive massive investment in aerospace research and development, transforming American science and engineering in the process. Universities expanded their engineering programs. Government laboratories were built across the country. Private aerospace companies grew from small operations into massive corporations employing tens of thousands. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower would warn about in 1961 was, in many ways, born from the lessons of the V-2. America had been caught unprepared by German rocket technology. It would not be caught unprepared again. The V-2 also reshaped American thinking about the role of scientists and engineers in national security. Before World War II, scientific research was largely an academic pursuit. conducted at universities and private institutions with minimal government involvement. The Manhattan Project had begun to change that, showing that organized scientific effort directed toward military goals could produce results of staggering power. The V-2 reinforced this lesson. It demonstrated that technological superiority could be a decisive factor in warfare and geopolitical competition. The result was a new paradigm, one in which the federal government became the primary funder of advanced scientific research, in which scientists and engineers were integrated into national security planning, and in which the boundaries between academic research and military application became blurred. This transformation had profound effects on American society, most of them positive in terms of technological advancement and economic growth, but some troubling in terms of the militarization of science and the ethical compromises involved in defense research. Robert Goddard did not live to see the full flowering of the rocket age he had pioneered. He died in August 1945, just months after examining the V-2, his health broken by years of overwork and perhaps by the bitterness of seeing others receive credit for his innovations. In the years after his death, his contributions were gradually recognized. His patents were purchased by the U.S. government for a substantial sum. His name was attached to NASA's premier spaceflight center. He was celebrated as the father of American rocketry. But during his lifetime, he was a prophet without honor, a brilliant inventor whose vision exceeded his nation's ability to comprehend it. The contrast between Goddard's obscurity and von Braun's celebrity is striking and perhaps instructive. Goddard worked alone, sharing little, distrustful of others, and achieved incremental progress on a shoestring budget. Von Braun worked with teams, built institutions, secured massive funding from his government, and achieved operational weapon systems. Both men were essential to the development of rocketry, but their paths could not have been more different. Goddard represented the lone genius, the individual inventor. Von Braun represented the organized research enterprise, the aerospace industrial complex. The history of rocketry after World War II would be defined by the latter model, for better or worse. The question of what the world might have looked like if Germany had not developed the V-2 is intriguing, but ultimately unanswerable. Would rocket technology have advanced as quickly without the impetus of German innovation and the subsequent American and Soviet rush to exploit captured technology? Would the space race have occurred at all, or would it have been delayed by decades? Would the Cold War have taken a different form if intercontinental ballistic missiles had not become the ultimate deterrent weapon? These are counterfactuals that can never be tested. What we know is that the V-2 accelerated developments that were probably inevitable, but might have taken much longer. Goddard and others had proven that rockets were feasible, but moving from small experimental vehicles to operational systems required resources, institutional support, and a compelling reason for governments to invest. The V-2 provided that reason. It demonstrated that rockets were not toys or curiosities, but serious weapons with strategic implications. And once that demonstration had been made, the race was on. Today, more than 80 years after the first V-2 launch, the world lives with the consequences of that technology. Nuclear-armed ballistic missiles remain the ultimate guarantor of great power security. The weapons that make large-scale war between superpowers unthinkable because the cost of conflict would be annihilation. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction, darkly abbreviated as MAD, rests on the foundation the V-2 laid. At the same time, the exploration of space, the placement of satellites that enable global communications and Earth observation, the scientific missions to other planets, the dream of human settlement beyond Earth, all of these are made possible by rocket technology descended from that first ballistic missile. The ambiguity remains unresolved. The technology that creates the means of destruction also creates the means of transcendence. We cannot separate these two aspects. They are intertwined, inextricable, the light and shadow of the same achievement. The American engineers who inspected the V-2 in the ruins of Nazi Germany in 1945 could not have foreseen all of this. They understood they were looking at something revolutionary. They recognized the sophistication of the engineering. They grasped the military implications, but they could not have imagined that they were looking at the ancestor of the rockets that would carry humans to the moon, that would launch space telescopes revealing the deep structure of the universe, that would place constellations of satellites enabling instant global communication, that would make possible the observation and study of Earth's climate, that would perhaps one day carry humans to Mars and beyond. Nor could they have imagined the nuclear standoff that would dominate the second half of the 20th century, the vast arsenals of intercontinental missiles pointed at cities around the world, the Cold War strategy of deterrence through the threat of mutual destruction. All of this flowed, in part, from the technology they were examining in those captured tunnels. They were looking at the future, and they knew it, but the full scope of that future was beyond even their considerable imaginations. In the end, the V-2 rocket stands as one of the most consequential technological developments of the 20th century, comparable to the atomic bomb in its impact on warfare, geopolitics, and human capability. It was a weapon of terror that killed thousands and was built at the cost of even more lives through slave labor. It was a strategic failure that consumed resources Germany could not afford for minimal military effect. It was a technological marvel that leaped decades ahead of contemporary engineering. It was the foundation for space exploration and the key to unlocking the cosmos. It was the prototype for weapons of mass destruction that threaten human civilization. It was all of these things simultaneously, and we live with all of these legacies today. The American engineers who stood in the darkness of Nordhausen in May 1945, examining a rocket that looked like something from science fiction, were standing at a hinge point in human history. They could not have known it then, but they were witnesses to the birth of a new age, the rocket age, the space age, the age of intercontinental weapons and mutual assured destruction, the age in which Earth's atmosphere was no longer a boundary but a highway, in which the curve of the planet could be seen from above, in which the moon went from a distant celestial object to a place where humans walked. All of this began with the V-2, with the vision and ambition and moral compromises of the men who built it, and with the determination of those who captured it to ensure that its secrets would not remain in the rubble of a defeated regime, but would be carried forward, refined, and transformed into the technologies that define our modern world. The rocket from the ruins became the rocket to the stars, and in that transformation lies both humanity's greatest achievements and its most terrible dangers, forever intertwined.